this is the one about leading with equity in the classroom, and Kurt and I are co-hosts in here. So did you want to start, Kurt?
Sure, I can jump in. Let me see. Okay, so if I do a share screen and a whiteboard, you all see this, right? So I'm going to post our objectives here for the day, and we'll see how visible they are. Mixed success with the whiteboard and Zoom, but you know, it's better than my handwriting on a whiteboard where I always kind of arch downwards and end up somewhere in the corner of the whiteboard each time. Today we're going to do a couple of things. I'm going to take the lead in a second, but I want to introduce myself and have Sonia introduce herself. Hi, my name is Kurt Güner. I just finished my PhD here at the U in history, which is very exciting for me and not super important for you. But I've been spending a lot of time teaching, thanks Holly, workshops in race, class, and gender issues across the state. And you know, my overall focus is on how to build a kind of kinder and more empathetic classroom. And so this panel seemed like a good way to kind of talk about that. Dr. Salari?
Yeah. Thank you, Kurt. I am a professor over in Family and Consumer Studies, and my research has looked at like family violence across the life course. And there's a lot of inequity going on in the issue of family violence. So I think I'm going to sort of bring up some examples from that course in this little breakout session. And then as far as, you know, positions at the U, I'm also the president-elect of the Senate. So a lot of work coming up next year for me on that.
This is one of those small campus, small world moments. I've actually helped schedule some of Dr. Salari's classes, and students say very nice things about her. So if that helps at all. So put that feather in your cap. Well, we'll start with what I'll take these first two objectives, and I want to try and kind of work through a group definition of what equity in the classroom looks like from both the student and the instructor perspectives. I kind of want to think about how that perspective making kind of defines our class construction. Then I want to discuss how meeting students where they are can be accomplished through co-design concepts, and kind of go over some practices of what that looks like in your course design. And then Dr. Salari will kind of review some case studies in class material on identifying privilege, power, and discriminatory exclusion. She'll talk about how modules can be a great way to distinguish between required and optional work, and can be especially a great way to give students extra time to dive into topics that they really attach to. And then finally, she'll reflect on the importance of including both positive and negative info about underrepresented groups. It's not all scary photos of gang shootings, right? There's complicated cultural stuff that we're overlooking when we do that. So let me dive in. I will stop my screen share. So what I want us to do first, and I'll go back to the whiteboard in a second, but it looks like we have mostly instructors here, which is just fine. And I won't comment on anyone's ages or backgrounds, but think back however long you have to think back to when you were an undergraduate student in college, and think about what sort of things you expected from your instructor, from your course, and what equity might have looked like to you then. It's kind of hard to do that sometimes because we're so caught up in our knowledge of now, right? But try to think back to the needs and desires you had back then, what a good class was, and what equity looked like. Then I want you to think about how your instructor can construct that course for you, right? Again, you're a fresh-faced 19, 20-something, you're in this course and you're looking for an equitable education. What does the instructor do for you that makes that happen? And if you can think of particular instructors who did do that, that's a good place to find examples. And then finally, think about how is a lack of equity noticeable in your classroom? So what I want us to do as we think about these things, I'm going to just write them up on the board. and I want to kind of jot down some of the ideas we've come up with. And so feel free to unmute yourself and kind of check in. But thinking back to when we were students, what did an equitable classroom look like to you then? And what was the sort of thing you were looking for as you entered these classroom spaces?
I can think of something has to do with sort of that need for gender equity. And so it didn't always feel like there was a lot of that back then. And this is a long time ago. But without really thinking about intersections, I really just thought of it as like black or white, you know, one or the other, and not realizing more about intersections, which we know about more these days.
So I don't want to say that, because I think what you're saying is it was a less complicated view of race, class, and gender at that age, right? It wasn't, you weren't looking at these kind of intersectional complications. You were just looking at, is the instructor a woman? Do I have a equal split in the classroom? Does that sound about right?
Right. Really, many of our instructors were men back then, even in social scientists, in social sciences.
That's great. That's a great example. What else do we think when we're thinking about what kind of equitable classroom you'd be expecting at that point in our lives?
There's something wrong with your audio a little bit, Kurt.
Sorry.
At least from my end, it seems to like.
Yeah, I got quiet.
You got a little
Sorry
bit
about that.
quiet.
Any better now?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay. So what else do we think? Gender equity is a great place to start. What are some of the things that we were looking for as students when we enter the class?
There's some items in the chat too.
Oh, are there? Okay, I did not see that. Let's see.
Mhm.
Oh, great. Students and faculty that look like me. So I'm going to put representation. Manisha, does that sound right? Or sorry, it was Scola.
Yes, that sounds right. Sorry, I'm off the camera.
Totally fine. Professorial authority. Johanna, what do you think about that?
It was kind of unquestioned,
Okay.
that it was not like a collaboration or learning in the sense of how we think about it now, but it was unquestioned authority of professor and in terms of gender equity, male professor.
The sage on the stage, right?
Yeah, exactly. Sage on the stage.
Delivering upon you the information, and you are a passive vessel waiting to be, filled there. Oh, great. The dialogue on difficult topics. And no overt. Now, I think, Marissa, you included no overt discrimination purpose. What does the word overt mean when you put it in there?
I think I was thinking not really microaggressions, but just flat out like saying women aren't good at math. I mean, I was in a math class where the professor said that. So to me, that was like, oh yeah, okay, that's not okay. But maybe some of the more subtle stuff, my experience probably maybe was more like Monisha's. I mean, some of it went over my head, I would say.
Right. And it's interesting too, because we all didn't know the terms for these experiences. Microaggressions I learned much later, right? And I was kind of like, oh, that explains a lot of my childhood, right? but you're not always looking out for the stuff until you know the concepts. And so at that stage, you're just waiting for an instructor to not say this race of people are good or bad, right? That's a great start. So what I want to do now that we have much more experience, let's think about what this looks like from the instructor perspective. So when you think about, I'm going to bring equity into my classroom, what does that look like? Oh, Manisha, I want to read your comment first. I wonder if there's a relationship between the cluelessness I had and the professional authority Johanna referenced. Oh, interesting. So, that authority, right? It is in some ways reassuring in like, this is the expert person, but then you also kind of become more passive in that interaction. And it can be.
I think that also obscures, that's such a salient difference between you as the students and the professor, that it really obscures other inequities. They're all much, when you talk about it being micro, it's invisible next to that kind of huge divide. So
that's someone, if anyone's a social science scholar, that's a term paper right there, or a application probably on that distinction. But let's think now about the instructor perspective, right? So now we've learned, we've had our lots of experiences, we've built our careers around this thing. How do we ensure that all of our students have what they need to succeed? How do we build an equitable classroom and potentially meet the needs of our previous selves we just discussed?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, please do.
Hi. I just wanted to kind of elaborate a little bit about my comment. Challenging perspectives in the classroom environment with intention for growth and increasing awareness, but not from a character assassination or character flaw, but challenging the mindset and how students and as faculty, I think of certain topics or ideas. And so having that honest conversation between faculty and students that may not be comfortable, but needed.
It's an incredibly important but difficult line to straddle, right? You want to encourage people to participate, and that participation makes them vulnerable. You want to have them suggest a thought that they might not have fully formed yet. And then you need to then say, well, here's how that thing can be misconstrued, but here's where I think you're going. Let's get into it, right? And that kind of facilitator role is really essential to make this stuff work. That's a great perspective. Manisha, go ahead.
So I would actually be curious about people's perspectives on this, but one of the things that I have been thinking about quite a lot are some of the things that students who have a successful undergraduate career do or get engaged with, like research or internships or kind of building mentoring relationships with faculty. Sort of the literature that suggests that there are things students do that contribute to their success, and that to some extent those things that students are doing are less available and less accessed by students from some groups relative to students from other groups. And so one of the things that I've tried to think about is how to build that knowledge into things that I'm teaching by, for example, trying to make everyone do those things that foster success, and trying to have everyone do that in a way that is where they're given preparation and are given the scaffolding. So, I have a son who's a student here. Professors are not scary people to him. Like, he grew up knowing professors. He grew up assuming that professors meet with students because we talked about meeting. So there's just a lot of privilege in that he just brings to the table. And so trying to compensate for that for students who don't have that kind of tacit knowledge, by actually making people do it. And I have mixed feelings about it internally, but I'd be interested in people's perspectives on that.
Yeah, let's dive in. I mean, first of all, how hard can it be to be a professor if mom does it, right? Like, but that's such
not hard,
salient,
also not attractive.
right. But that's such a salient point, though, because that next, I don't know how to. There's first gen. I'm not sure how to say next gen, multiple gen, but that extra knowledge of how the campus works and how you do have the right to ask your professor this, ask your advisor this. Some schools offer college essentials courses, and I've been back and forth on their viability, but ways to kind of just codify that knowledge as part of the everyday experience. Every student has to take it. For first-gen students, the lifesaver. For other students, it would be kind of review. But I think it's a great idea to build in that information. What comes to mind, and I'd love to hear the feedback from the rest of the group, for me is, counseling center, writing center, math tutors, learning success center, student success advocates. I imagine those are things that students don't realize they can access. And that when I've told students about it, I say, well, you've already paid for it, right? You've already paid for these services. Why not use them? And that does not work some of the time. But are there other services we can think of that you might build into your course to kind of help achieve that equity among students, among the first gen and the other gen students?
Yeah, I think we also need to take into account the idea that there are going to be some people who are, working 3 jobs and trying to do university work at the same time. So it might be considered a little bit of a luxury to be able to utilize those services and resources. So.
I work a lot with adult learners, and that's one of the biggest complaints is that
Mhm,
services, but they're all 9 to 5, and I can't get there.
exactly.
Johanna, you had your hand up, and then Scully had a comment. Johanna,
Yeah, I was just going to say, as we do that, building this kind of knowledge in the classroom, I think maybe one step before that is also to kind of interrogate and question our own norms and expectations and how we define success and what that might mean in terms of equity, that there are certain expectations and norms that are obviously, using the terminology from earlier, sort of centered on whiteness. And so
Mhm.
even the sort of success narrative is often framed by the kinds of norms, expectations that we have of middle-class white students who come with certain privileges.
Mhm. That's a great point. And I think that active interrogation is very important. I don't know how many of you do this, but when I finish a course every semester, I always have to do an immediate, course semester in review. Okay, what worked, what didn't work? Here's some student comments. Here's how I can fix this. Because if I wait any longer, I forget all the details, and you end up thinking, it was all right. But interrogating it as you're building the course is important as well. As you think about what you're expecting your students to do. One practice that was really helpful for me that I learned about in my CTLE days back with Holly was just a practice of trying to identify what your ideal classroom looks like, and then how you can help your students get there and how they can help you get there. And it's very different for everyone. I teach history. I'm a very discussion heavy, writing heavy course. I imagine ideas flying around, people being vulnerable. Maybe someone cries, maybe someone does. I don't know. That's what I think of as an ideal classroom. So for me, that requires adapting certain techniques, modeling certain behaviors, and providing certain skills, teaching certain skills to my students so they can achieve that. And I think building interrogation would also help me kind of realize, well, wait a minute, am I building my course just to field extroverts who, like me, learn by talking? Am I building a course that is just all for the philosophical students who love to just spout off, and then the introverts in the corner who want to write out their ideas are being blocked, right? And little things like that. And if it does help, I am working on it. It is hard and slow work. But Scola, you said COIL in the chat. I was going to ask what that refers to. I'm sure it's an acronym that I should know, but I don't.
I like writing notes to myself in the chat and accidentally entered anyways. But I was still gonna say it. But so a little background. I'm relatively new to the U family. I'm an assistant professor in the College of Nursing, and my training, both Ph.D. and postdocs, were in the San Francisco Bay Area. So to say the very least, the classroom environment looks a little bit different in Utah. But, as I think about how I can lead with equity in terms of my practice, a few things that come to mind is, one, using evidence-based practice in my teaching to be able to support the positions that I may take or that I may communicate and teach my students. But also I've been looking and been, discussing ways in which not only to promote diversity in terms of, as the previous panelists were talking about, in terms of the staff and professoriate and student body, but also looking at the classroom in terms of the diverse perspectives, the diverse curriculum, and COIL, which is a model that has been used by several institutions, which is collaboratory, I think, online international learning, that promotes some of that in terms of, promoting these internationalization or really transcultural learning experience, especially in these times when we can't travel anymore to get those study abroad experiences. How can we still be able to inform education, inform practice, whatever our specialties are, through, models such as that one, where individuals can still share the knowledge, diverse knowledge and background, and how those lenses inform how they practice whatever the discipline is. So yes, that's what the COIL was about.
Great. You don't always know what the different acronyms mean, but it's always kind of fascinating to learn, well, this is how this field has conceptualized this similar concept to what I've heard, but in a different perspective. This is all great. I want to keep moving, but what I want to also hit on before we leave is this last question is, what kind of preparation is necessary to do all this stuff, to create this classroom? What kind of work do you need to put in? And I mentioned that because I think a lot of times when a lot of this is self-selection, right? The instructors who've chosen this panel are interested in this concept. They think it's important, and we are all often putting that work in, but it can be a lot. It can be quite intimidating for some people. So, what kind of work do you need to do to make this sort of stuff happen?
Self-reflection, cultural humility.
Mm-hmm. And humility can be especially challenging when you're used to the one dominant culture perspective, right? It's a lot of work, and it's a lot of vulnerability, and it's not as easy to just reuse that past lecture without kind of interrogating it, without reworking it, analyzing it, and kind of factoring in student feedback. Sometimes I think we can kind of focus on course content to the detriment of course design and course construction. And I think in this case, I can see how all of this equity discussion can actually change the way we approach the content we're delivering to students in a positive way. And Sonia will kind of dive in on that a bit more in her section. But I think the main concept that I want to get across to you all is that I don't believe it's possible to create a perfectly equitable course that does all the things you mentioned and perfectly anticipates the needs of all of our students ahead of time. What I think we can do is create a very flexible course that takes as much of that into account as possible. And we build into the bones of that structure the ability to adapt to our students' needs as we encounter them. And so the phrase meet people where they are comes from all over, but in the classroom, what that means to me is that you can never predict whatever crazy situation a student's going to come up with. You can never have predicted COVID before it happened. I mean, some people did, but for now. So, you as an instructor probably couldn't predict this pandemic and jumping onto Zoom. But what we can do is create a syllabi and create a course design that allows us to, if necessary, kind of shift and move around. So I think since we all care about equity, because we're all here to kind of talk about it, we can kind of talk a little bit about co-design. Has anyone here any experience with co-design concepts and kind of co-creation concepts, working with students to recreate your class each semester? So I see Sonia's hands up. I know
I'm not quite fully there yet, but I am in the inclusive design workshop. So that really has a lot to do with trying to have sort of a co-design model.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are varying degrees of co-design. And I think what I'm going to try and introduce to you is just a very tiny baby footstep into that world. Because I think that jumping in whole hog into co-design and starting it from scratch with that much preparation would be pretty disastrous. And I think a lot of it just depends on particular students you interact with. But what co-design is is aiming at doing is bringing students into the conversation about how the course construction works, how grading works, how assessments work, content, readings, the overall scope of the course. And in some cases that can be a really broad remaking and reimagining. I've heard of instructors who go into the course with very little, just here are the major outcomes I want in the semester, here's the main readings, how should we do it? And then they really get into it. I can see that working really well with particular classes that I've had, and I can see it working pretty terribly with other classes that I've had. So it really does, I think, depend on the audience you have. There's also a kind of much easier entry point. And so I imagine we've all had very complicated syllabi in our times. I come into my classes and we do our syllabi discussion. and I have students look at assessments, grade distribution, quizzes and tests and papers and all that kind of stuff and say, what should we do about this? What do you want to keep? What do you want to get rid of? And you'd be surprised, most students, of course, immediately think it's a trick. And they say, we love writing. We would never get rid of any papers. It's so much fun. It's not a trick. I'm not trying to lie to you, but what can we honestly adjust? And I think once students realize that this is a real thing, they usually will offer something kind of small, like, well, maybe we can get rid of late penalties on papers. And I do it. And then they go, oh, wait a minute. He's for real. Okay. And then we kind of start getting into it. And what I found is that students really enjoy that empowerment and they have some buy-in here, right? And so this past semester, I had students insist that the number of papers I had listed was perfectly adequate. It wasn't too much, and they were going to have a great time. And it's going to be fine. Don't worry about it. They adjusted the grade distribution a little bit. They made the final paper way less because they were concerned that that'll be their last submission before the semester ends. They wouldn't know their grade for 2 weeks. And it's kind of anxiety producing if 35% of their grade is waiting in the wings and they don't know what it's going to be. And I thought, that's absolutely true. I had not considered that. So we lowered that. We kept the page amount. And as the semester goes along, there's a lot of writing. And this is deeply adorable to me, but a student who had kind of pushed the pro writing agenda said, I think I was wrong. This is a lot. This is making me very stressed out. Can we talk about that again? And the students were like, oh my God, yes, thank you. And we had a discussion. And I said, I suggested this might be too much writing and you told me I was crazy, and let's have this conversation. And we ended up canceling a paper later in the semester that I thought was a bit redundant anyway. But it was fascinating because they had that buy-in. They had agreed to it and they had participated in it, and they felt it was almost awkward to bring it up, but they could bring it up. And that vulnerability I'd kind of modeled over the course of the semester of owning up to your mistakes and having that kind of conversation. So that led to a lot of enthusiasm and like kind of enthusiastic responses to our conversations. And I felt an uptick in the general mood over the next couple of class sessions. And that's a very, very basic co-design concept. It's a very, very easy entry point into it. And so I'm not saying you all have to come in with a blank paper and design the course on the first day, but if you can find small ways to give students buy-in and to kind of let them say, here are the areas where I'm not so sure about, here are the things that I'm kind of not confident about, you might find some really surprising responses. That can also help with extroverts and introverts and the different learning styles, because students might say, this is a lot of group activity. I don't like that. Great, let's find something else. And you might have a class full of drama kids who say, this is great, more presentations, whatever. Each classroom dynamic is a little bit different. Any questions or thoughts on co-design before we kind of move on and I wrap up here?
I do think it flies in the face a little bit in terms of what we're expected to do as professors. We hand a syllabus that is considered like a legal contract, right? And we're supposed to follow it. So yeah. It just makes me nervous to just be talking about throwing out assignments and some people feeling like, wait, I already did that one, or something like that. And then did I do all that for nothing? Or, it really is having to, get rid of the hard wiring that we have, especially for those of us who have been around a while, and try to do it differently. Teaching an honors class was like that for me. The Praxis Lab, we have them just design the whole course from the bottom up.
Oh, wow.
So that's
it's nerve-wracking. I mean, all of your years of training, right, are being kind of dumped over, and all of a sudden you feel awkward and almost out of place. But Scola, before we move on, what was your comment?
Well, I was just curious, Kat, about the shared design approach. What are some of the challenges you found with that, or anybody else who has used that approach?
The challenges I've had in previous semesters, this semester is going pretty well, but I've had challenges where students who are not majors in the course and are just taking it to check a box will kind of drag the conversation more towards how can we reduce the work and that sort of thing. And they didn't say it like that, but it was kind of you could see that the split was pretty clear of like who is interested in the subject matter and who is trying to only reduce grade penalties and make everything participation. And to me, I look at education as something where, you know, if a student doesn't get the exact founding date of the Ottoman Empire right, no one's going to die on the operating table. So I don't see history as a super essential thing in mastering the minutia in that way. So, you know, nursing perhaps a little different, right? But to me, I just lean into the changes. If the students really want to rework the course and to be a completion type situation, and that's what they're looking for, I can dive into that. I can see that being challenging if you have a co-design suggestion from a bunch of students to take away some of the rigor that you need to guarantee they know the concepts for patient health, right? Or for, you know, for these really complicated machines to work. That can be a bit trickier. And so the humanities perspective does definitely affect my thoughts there. So maybe you just had a comment. Not in practice lab, other contexts we've tried it, students complain about not getting PhDs in the teaching. Oh, interesting. So is this because minority students in particular, Manisha, you've noticed have wanted more PhD instructors, or the opposite? I'm not, Manisha, did you hear that? Sorry, I think you're typing, I can't tell. Okay, gotcha. Yes. So a small chunk of the class would be annoyed that, oh, this is an adjunct or a grad student and they are not impressive to me. That's interesting. When I was a grad student, I usually didn't get any pushback from that, but I'm also a relatively tall guy. And that makes things a lot easier in terms of expertise. When I worked at CTLA, I would watch award-winning PhD women get harangued by their students about their dissertation topics. And I was kind of like, that's the one topic that they know more than anyone else in the planet. And you're calling them a liar? Like, this is, and it was kind of a mind-blowing experience. But I have definitely had students say things, as Marissa's pointing out, like, well, that's not our job. Like, I've come here to learn from you. And I think that can only be addressed if you really are building an explicit, this framework is collaboration, and that's how we're gonna succeed. But yeah, I can see, especially, you know, I have a lot of, my family is immigrated from Turkey, and I had a lot of Turkish grad students. The Turkish education system is very sage on the stage, mentorship style. And for some of them, they came to these classes and were looking at this like, well, this isn't what I expected at all. You know, this is much more hand-holding and much less rigor than I expected from the great American universities. I would say that in that case, you should build the course based on what your students need. Again, if you try a co-design concept and all the students say, we don't want that, that was co-design. You know, they told you that they want to stick with the syllabus you created and they don't want to have too much commentary. And that's okay too. You know, in the end, I think if you offer that empowerment and students say, thanks, but no thanks, that's perfectly acceptable, right? And that doesn't need to be something you force into a conversation. But I don't want to dominate the time, so I think I'm going to hand it off to Sonia now. I think the very ending kind of comment that I would add here is that your role as an instructor often includes facilitation, it includes handling difficult conversations about race or gender or sexuality, and depending on the field, that is more common than not. But a lot of the time, you need to kind of figure out what sort of course you want to provide for students. Identify what kind of style of teaching you want, which I think we take for granted, but really, as Johanna said, interrogate what it is we're bringing to the table and what we want to do, and then explicitly tell students, this is what I want to build. Can you help me get there? If you are having your students go towards an imaginary goal and they don't know what the goal is and they fail, that's not really their fault. They didn't know that you wanted a discussion Socratic seminar. They thought you wanted silence and note-taking, right? So being able to tell students directly, this is what I want, this is what I'm looking for, also helps them hold you accountable. Because if you start lecturing when you said you wanted a Socratic seminar and they say, what happened to the discussion? Hey, that's on me. I shouldn't have gone off track like that. But on that note, I'll hand it to Sonia and we can jump into her few objectives on modules and course construction.
Yeah, thank you. And I do pull quite a bit from that inclusive design workshop that I've been taking. I really have learned quite a bit from it, and I'm trying to meet with the faculty in my department sort of on a monthly basis during our faculty meetings, just to have another conversation about EDI, so that we're never just compartmentalizing it and saying like, okay, we're done with that right now or anything like that, but it's like a continual bringing a new idea about it. And classroom is part of what I've talked about with that, and research also, and mentoring and things like that. So it's just a way to keep the conversation going. And some of the things that I would include in a classroom situation, I also have to include when I'm talking to the faculty. So that idea, it's my favorite quote from this design workshop is you know, moving at the speed of trust. And so trust is really important to create, you know, within the classroom environment. And I teach family violence. So believe me, you have to create a comfortable environment where people don't feel defensive. And there might be all kinds of walks of life where people come from. So this is just another, you know, point with regard to making the classroom, you know, more equitable and leading with inclusion and so forth. The other thing is the idea of leaning into discomfort. So again, talking about family violence, we're already there a lot of the time, really uncomfortable with what we have to talk about. And it's a whole semester worth and that sort of thing. So there needs to be a way to, you know, just have that environment that is comfortable, like you said, for the extroverts, comfortable for the introverts. And I personally am more of an introvert. So, so I always make sure that the introverts are comfortable, I think. And so you and I would do great at a co-teaching situation, I think. But, you know, that's part of making the classroom comfortable. And so, yeah, some of the thoughts that I had with regard to, you know, the coursework and really looking at what I have from maybe slideshows that I've been showing all these years and the updates that I do. I do like that idea of not just bringing forth sort of the downer material about racism, you know, but also bringing forth like cultural customs and the positive things about what it means to be BIPOC and, you know, going and old or whatever the intersectionalities. So like that idea of maybe talking about grandparenthood among Native Americans, Indigenous folks, and not just like focusing on maybe the poverty level or the alcoholism or the, you know, there's just so many things that when you look things up about some of the groups that we are trying to bring forward and talk about on a regular basis, it can kind of be sort of a negative thing, and just realizing that from the perspective of the student, you know, maybe a BIPOC student, you know, what are they hearing that is being conveyed? So I like to make sure that there's a lot of positive aspects. You know, we have the Two-Spirit people, for example, who, you know, this has been considered to be a position of strength among Indigenous folks and that sort of thing. So it's not considered to be like, oh, which are you, male or female? And, you know, that sort, but it's just a completely different way of thinking about it. That is a positive thing. Shula, did you have a point? You have your hand up?
Oh, it was a while ago, but as you were speaking, I could also help reflecting on, you know, that balance that we have to strike between, you know, yes, delivering the positive and the negative together, but also being mindful not to, you know, cater to, you know, white fragility, or looking at ways to cater to the majority
Exactly.
race in the, you know, just so it's not, you know, hurtful to, you know, the dominant group of, so you know, it's that balance that we strike, you know, because conversations about race, racism, and so on and so forth, white supremacy, yes, it's not, you know, comfortable, but it's necessary. And so it's just that kind of balance of, yes, we can present the positive, but in terms of the work that we are doing to promote equity, you know, we have to point out the elephant in the room, however downer or uncomfortable it may be. So that's kind of what was coming to mind as we were talking. And the other comment I had was around how can we have this conversation or strategies around, you know, in the same spirit of leading with equity in the classroom, not only student focus, which is of course what we all aim for, but also for the faculty in terms of protecting the faculty who often, especially minority, whether gender or racial or other, who often may receive a different kind of treatment from our students that often impact their promotion and, you know, other areas of their development. So I think as we speak of the classroom, being mindful of what the well-being of faculty is, and I think getting advice and you know, suggestions on how we can still be able to foster that in the classroom environment, so that a happy faculty leads to happy students. You know, we can be able to promote that.
Yeah, very good. I appreciate your input there. And I think you're right, definitely. And that's another way of thinking, is the faculty member who is, you know, the person who might be receiving some negativity from student evals or whatever. So those are all important things to take into consideration for sure. Also, I think, you know, we want to make sure that the course has has sort of, you know, a flavor to it that is not just that white perspective, and make sure that the readings might be authored by others as well, and that can not just be in terms of readings, but also just bringing in a quote can be helpful. Pictures, you know, poems, all kinds of things from various authors, and so that the reading materials and just the look of the course can be definitely more inclusive. And making sure that the language makes sense as well. I am a gerontologist, so sort of that thought about across the life course and all kinds of different abilities is important. So there's a whole way of speaking about persons with disabilities that, you know, it's important that you kind of get that right. So I think it's helpful to really do research in terms of looking at what folks themselves believe to be the correct language to use. And it can go for like talking about gender as well. So the idea of even saying ladies and gentlemen, you know, that's actually not including everyone. And so that is something that you might want to modify away from. But yeah, this is like some of what and I learned a lot from examining what the native nations would like, to have in terms of conversation, because you oftentimes hear of, tribes or reservations and things like that, and realizing that the way they see themselves is more like a nation and sharing, similar land and that sort of thing. So I also have this, the issue of case studies, because not wanting to just make it, this has been kind of a challenge for the family violence field, because I've been working closely with a team where we're looking at COVID and some of the other issues going on in our society, and how, part of it has to do with law enforcement and racism and that sort of thing. So a lot of times the question is like, well, that historical case, is that like just a white woman's case? Because that's a little bit different from how it's going to be perceived by other folks. And that question about, what is the role of the police? And so it's not just about George Floyd, but things like the Gabby Petito case, and how, she went missing, and this is horrible. And her family was devastated, obviously. And then we find out it's a domestic violence murder. But we also have hundreds of others who, Indigenous women who have gone missing, men of color have gone missing. And, these kinds of even human trafficking and issues like that, what happened to these people? They just like disappeared with literally no attention to that. So that's kind of another way of thinking about the violence, and it's certainly not okay that Gabby was murdered like that. And it's not okay that, the case was maybe misinterpreted by those who knew about it and that sort of thing. But we also need to realize that we have to broaden our minds and start, being as concerned about the other people who are missing. So that was just an example that I thought of. And that the fact that some people actually fear calling police at all. And so that's something that means that safety, that, like they were talking about in our talk today, the talk about public safety, versus policing. How do we recognize that? That's really heavily, intertwined with that issue of domestic violence. So that's been an area where I have used modules, and maybe people are interested in a particular type of victimization, and then you can go further into that by having optional, usually I like to do a lot of videos on, a documentary, documentaries in my family, modern family class on redlining, for example. And so that one happens to be required, but then I have a number of others that go into more detail there, that people could go into if they would like to, which are more optional. And I actually have heard that people are using those. And one person was saying she cries during work because she's watching the videos and things like that. And I don't mean for it to be always, that sort of message, but I'm glad to hear it's getting through to someone and they're voluntarily looking deeper into some of these issues. So I've really enjoyed modules. And
Sorry,
so,
sorry to interrupt, Sonia, but
Mhm.
I want to point out is that by having it there actively, instead of having students telling students, if you want more information, please ask me, right? That's a
Mhm.
small, very small, but very real barrier and hurdle they have to get over. Not every student is afraid to talk to an interrogator, but some would be nervous or not feel like they have the time and space or the privilege to do it. But just putting it there, they can dive in at their leisure and they have access to it every time. I think that
Mhm.
shift towards a more active, planning ahead process, instead of saying, I know all these articles, just ask me, I can give you all the recommendations you want.
Mhm.
I'm already making a note because I always tell students, please ask me, but I'm thinking I should just put them on there and then they can go whenever they want. So thanks for doing
Yeah. And also another thing that's helpful is to put, and videos are big, but some of these videos are only 4 minutes long. So I say after the title, I say, this is 4 minutes, so then they're like, okay, I can do 4 minutes, but something like that. And then on the other hand, if it's going to be a commitment, this is a 2-hour documentary. So then they know that they don't get involved in something that they, until they have time to look at that. So I do feel like we're much more into the video world these days, and that's a way to really connect. And actually, with Gabby's case, one reason why she was so well known is because she was a social media influencer, and so that shows that people are willing to just stare at videos quite a bit and learn from that as well. So it's kind of a new mechanism. I've always used little video clips in my classes, but this is bringing more of those. And it does take a lot of, background work and so forth, but it's actually just really, it's not bad because I felt like I learned a lot when I put those together as well. So, yeah, so I think I would love to hear what other people, have to say about all this.
Definitely going to include those optional readings directly on there now, instead of, I promise you, I tell students every class, if this is interesting, let me know, I've got more readings. And once in a blue moon, they follow up. But
They'll take you up on
just
that.
having them in there, video, podcast, article, and general, this is an hour long, this is 10 minutes, 10-minute read, this is a 4-minute video.
Mhm.
I can see that being just much smarter. And it's like, we already have the information. I just need to take the weekend and put them on there. So
Exactly. What other ideas do we have, or anything else? I mean, I can always talk more. I think that, yeah, Shula, did you have another point?
No, I didn't. Thank you.
Okay. I wondered, I saw your camera come back, but well, we really appreciate you joining us. And hopefully some of the things that we've talked about have been helpful, to.
How often do we have these conversations? I feel like I need to make an appointment to come back here.
I think she said October 22nd is the next one, right? I wrote that down.
yeah, I put a link in the chat there. So you have these Friday forums, and I would every month, every other month, it feels like, yeah. I think the problem is I was out of commission for a couple months, so I lost the pattern. But they're on different themes, and the only trick I would say is that register ahead of time, because if you forget and try to register the day of, you can't, and so you're kind of blocked at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Kurt, do you mind sharing that screen you are noting those ideas on for a second, please?
Let me, I don't know if it's still on the whiteboard. Let's see. Share screen. Oh, yeah, it's still there. Clearly I'm a Zoom master.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing these. I'm gonna look into it further.
Yeah, there's a lot of
Yeah,
Florida University does a lot of that, but there's a lot of many other resources and different case studies of different institutions that have used that model. It's collaborative online.
and it's interesting, you know, hearing Sonia talk about this perspective from the FCS world, right? And that's, I wouldn't say tangent to history, right? It's more social sciencey and we're more humanities, but there's these overlaps and these kind of different angles, and it's,
Yeah.
I always think it's fascinating, but that's kind of the nature of our siloed university. They talked about that in the main session. I don't really know how you solve that with a campus this big, but it is a challenge for sure.
Yeah. Thank you both for facilitating this.
Yeah, thanks for coming. We
Thank
really
you for
appreciate you
coming.
guys participating.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, it looks like we're close to the ending, so
Yeah.
we'll let
Thanks,
people
Holly.
if there's not more. So
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
thank you.